Hi everyone, I'm Rukshan and this is the third video of this tutorial series. In this series, we are going to implement a server-side timer using WebSockets with Socket.io, NestJS and Flutter. In the previous video, we did the implementation of our backend application using NestJS framework, and in this video, we are going to implement the front end using Flutter framework, and also we are going to connect our front end and backend. And finally, we are going to have a demo of our final result, that is the server-side timer. So I'm excited about this and let's get started. For this third video also, I'm going to be using my written tutorial series, so I will link it in the description below. The code for this part as well, including the whole source code, will be available in my GitHub as well. Okay, so the first thing is create a new Flutter project. I assume that you have already installed Flutter and that you have working installation of Flutter. If you don't have it, please go to Flutter documentation and there is some couple of settings that you might want to set up, and after that you're good to go. Another thing is that I'm using Flutter 2 and specifically Flutter 2.5.2 with null safety. Although Flutter 3 is out, I have more experience with Flutter 2.5.2 and it seemed very stable, and that is why I'm using that version. If you want to try with the new version, please let me know how it will go. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is create a Flutter project. To do that, all you have to do is copy this command flutter create, and then this will be the name of our Flutter front-end application. It can be any name you want, but I'm going to use this name. Okay, so I'm getting back to VS Code, and this is where we left off from our previous video. So you can see our backend implementation using NestJS. So within the same root folder, I'm going to create a new folder called Frontend. And then inside that, I'm going to go to that, open in integrated terminal, and then paste that command flutter create server timer frontend. So that I hit enter, and then it will tell me that it is doing all the work that is needed to initialize a new Flutter project. So it will take around a couple of seconds, and then you have a new Flutter project initiated in your directory. Now if you expand this front-end folder, you will be able to see all the files that are related to a new Flutter project. Okay, so inside this lib folder is where we are going to be creating all our files, all our source code. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do is initialize our Android emulator. So let me start my Android emulator and get back. Okay, now we have our Android emulator running, and to test this default Flutter application that is given to us by default by the Flutter team, we can just go here to the top right and click start debugging. Okay, and that will start to run our Flutter application on this emulator, and this will take a couple of minutes to first set up it in our Android emulator, but after that it will be very fast. First time it will be a little bit slow. Okay, I'll get back when this is completed. Okay, so now we are running our application on our Android emulator. So this is the basic Flutter application that is given to us by default, and you can run it like this. So it's just a counter. Okay, so what we are going to do is replace all these things with our code, and then we can run it like this as well. Okay, so let's get to our article. So the next thing we have to do is install the Socket.io client package required for Flutter. Since we are using Socket.io library in our backend as well, we have to have a compatible version of that Socket.io client for our frontend. And if not, our Socket.io connections will not properly connect with the backend and the frontend. Therefore, it is very important that we are using the correct versions, otherwise this connection will not work. Now, I have tested several packages for Flutter to be used as a Socket.io client, but the only package that worked well for me was this socket_io_client package, and that is why I'm using that. If you want to experiment with other packages, feel free, but now I'm using this package. So we can install it or add it to our Flutter project by copying this command. Go to VS Code, and you have to go to our Flutter project, open it in integrated terminal, and then paste it, hit enter. So this will add the package Socket.io client into our Flutter project. So it will take a couple of seconds, and then it will run this Flutter pub-get, which is the way Flutter will actually install that package into our application. You can confirm that the installation took place by going to this pubspec.yaml file, and thereby when you go to this dependencies, you can see that we have in fact installed Socket.io client version 2. This is the latest version of this package, and it supports null safety as well. To maintain all of our code files, let's create a new folder called sockets inside our lib folder. So go to the lib and create a new folder called sockets. Okay, this is where we will put all of our code related to WebSockets. And then the next thing we have to do is create a socket service. Now socket service is where we are going to connect to our backend, disconnect from our socket connection, and handle all other listeners as well. So this is the most important file in our front end related to WebSocket communication. Okay, so let's create a socket service.dart file here, socket_service.dart. The file name again doesn't really matter, but I'm going to use this name. Okay, here we are going to implement three main methods for now. So the first one would be connect and listen to socket. The second one would be disconnect socket, and the third one will be disport socket. So this connect and listen to socket does what it says. It's going to try to connect to the socket and then listen to any event sent by our backend to our client. So that way we are listening to any message sent from our NestJS server to our Flutter client. Okay, so let's copy this and then paste it here. Then what we have to do is we have to implement this connect and listen socket first. So you can see this connect and listen to socket method will actually take a string auth token and a string device ID as the arguments. Okay, so let's paste them here and uncomment this. Okay, now inside this method body we are going to have to populate it with some important things. The first one is this. Now this socket, this line, this whole thing is used to connect to our backend NestJS server. Okay, this is the IP address of our server. So this would be something like 192.168. something, and this 3000 is the port number. If you remember, in our main.ts of our backend, you will be able to see this 3000 here. So our backend application is listening on port 3000. That is why on our front end we have to use this 3000 like this. Now here the IP address may change from your router or your network connection, so you might want to put your own IP address here. So for mine it will be 1.12. So this actually changes from person to person. Okay, so this is a private IP address. And then this option builder is used to set various things that we need to say about our socket connection. For example, if you remember from our previous videos, I said in the handshake we need to send a token related to our user. So this is the place that we are actually doing it from the front end. We are using this setAuth method and we are passing this object, and one key of that object is going to be the token, and the value is going to be bearer space and then whatever auth token value is going to be here. So we have to send that auth token when we are trying to connect to our WebSocket. So this auth token may be returning from an authentication service like Firebase or something other like other service like that. Okay, so the other thing is we need to also send a device ID with our initial connection request. So that way in the backend the NestJS server knows how to create a different room for its user based on the user ID and the device ID as well. So that way we can send this device ID as set query, and thereby we are sending this variable's value through this query set query method. Okay, and that way our backend can catch this device ID just like it caught this auth token. And that way our socket connection now will be aware of our auth token and our device ID. Okay, so this is how this should be written. Don't worry about these errors due to imports. Now let's worry about them later after writing all other code as well. Now here, to get this device ID, you can use a package called device info plus. Now I'm not going to cover how we are going to get this device ID now because it would complicate things and it's not really necessary for now to get the WebSocket connection going. So I'll skip this for now. Okay, in this connect and listen to socket, first thing we have to do is check if the socket is already connected, and if it is not, we need to connect it. Okay, so we'll paste it here. If it is not connected, we are going to try to connect to it. And the next thing we have to do is set up some listeners to important events that are related to our WebSocket connection. For example, whenever our socket is connected, this socket.onConnect method will be invoked and it will print connected and listening to socket. Whenever our socket is disconnected, this onDisconnected method will be invoked and it will print disconnected from socket. Similarly, whenever any error is occurring, this will be invoked, and whenever an error is occurred when we try to connect to our socket, this onConnect error will be invoked. So these are some default method listeners that are given to us. So let's copy them and then paste it here. The next thing we have to do is create another listener, but this time this is a custom listener that we are going to write. Now this listener is important because this is the one that is listening to the timer event. Okay, so whenever we are going to set up a server-side timer, it has to tell, okay, now 10, 9, 8, 7, like that way for each second, this event is fired from our backend. And therefore, it is going to send a message under this event name, that is tick. Under this event name tick, it is going to send us a message. So in order to grab that event or catch that event, we have to have this listener on our front end. Okay, so let me copy this and paste it below all that other listeners. Now this timer events.tick is similar to what we had in our backend. It's just an enum. Okay, so we are getting this timer events.tick .toString split, and this whole thing will be resolved to something like tick. Okay, so that is a funny way in Flutter that we have to use enums. Okay, we have to write a lengthy code to get the enum. Okay, so this tick value is equivalent to this whole thing. Okay, I hope you got the idea. And whenever a message is coming from the backend to our front end under this tick event, then what we are going to do is execute this line. I will tell you what this line does. Okay, so the thing is, we are going to have a stream controller in Flutter to which we are going to add whatever data coming from our backend. Okay, so this stream socket.addResponse is what we are doing to add whatever data coming from the backend via our WebSocket connection, and we are going to add it to our stream controller. This stream socket we will be setting up in our next file. Now the next thing is we need to implement the disconnect socket and dispose socket methods. Okay, so these seem like very similar, but there is a very important difference between disconnect socket and dispose socket methods. The difference is, in disconnect socket, the listeners that we set up like this are not cleared when we execute this disconnect socket. Only thing we are doing is we are disconnecting from the socket. Still these listeners are listening on our front end. Okay, so if you want to start everything fresh, clearing all the listeners and disconnecting the socket, what we have to do is dispose the socket. Okay, the dispose socket will remove all the listeners, disconnect the socket so that we can start fresh next time. Okay, so that is the difference between disconnect socket and dispose socket. I think that is all what we have to do for that socket service file for now. Now we can move on to the next file, that is the timer service.dart. So we'll copy this code and then create a new file called timer_service.dart, and then we paste it. So here in this file we have to implement two methods. One is to start the server timer and then another is to stop the server timer. So when we click the buttons in our emulator, we will be calling these two methods to start and stop the server timer. So these two methods will be sending the relevant messages to the backend through our WebSocket connection to start the timer and stop the timer as required. Okay, so in these two, let's copy these two methods and I'll explain what each of these does. Okay, so here let me minimize our emulator. Okay, and then here these are static methods. The reason for using static methods is so we can easily access these methods, like we can access these like timer service dot start server's timer. Like that way we can easily access these methods without creating objects of this class. So that is why we are using static methods. So here what we are doing is we first check, before starting the timer, we first check whether we have a socket connection, and if we have, what we are going to do is we are going to emit a message to our backend under a specific event. Now this event name will be resolved to something like start timer. Okay, so that is what actually going to be resolved. This whole thing is going to be resolved into a single string called start timer or timer start, doesn't matter. Okay, and then in the body of this message we are going to send the duration of that timer we require. So if we need 5 seconds, we are going to send this duration as 5. If we 10 seconds, then 10. Like that way we send the duration of the timer required. And this emit method given to us by this socket.io will send the message to our backend and it will be caught in our NestJS server. Okay, if I can quickly show you how this is caught in our backend, if you go to the sockets gateway and you go to the start timer, now here we are subscribing to the message under this timer start event. So whenever that message is sent from our front end, our backend is going to catch it under this method start my timer. And in the message body, we are going to have whatever data we send through the body. So that is here, the duration in seconds. And that value is going to be assigned to this body variable. And then we can access this duration using body.duration. So that is how the front end and the back end is connected in this socket communication. Okay, similarly to the stop server timer, we are sending this time the timer stop event, and then we don't have any body in that because we are just telling the server, okay, now you can stop the timer. So that message is the only thing that we have to send. Okay, and in our socket service, okay, on our socket gateway, we are going on our backend, we are going to subscribe to that timer stop event, and then we stop any timer related to that user device. So that is how the start and stop timer functions work. Again, don't worry about these squiggly lines because we are going to import them later on. Okay, and then the other thing we have to do is stream socket. Now this whole thing you can copy and let me minimize this. In our front end, we can create a new file called stream socket dot and then paste this. Okay, so here all we are doing is something related to Flutter. This is not very important for our socket integration itself, but I'm using this so that we can use this data returned from our backend very easily to update our Flutter UI on our emulator. So this is not really important for our socket communication itself, rather this is so that we can display the data on our front end very easily. So here we are having a stream controller which is actually imported from the Dart async library, and then we are having this variable so that we can have data added to this socket stream controller, the stream controller, whenever we get some data from our WebSocket communication. Okay, so this is just basic Flutter. If you don't understand how this all works, don't worry, because we are not really interested in how this stream socket works. We are just using it as a means to display that data. Okay, the next thing we have to do is create the events file. So let me copy this and then go to create a new file called socket_events.dart. Again, the file name really doesn't matter. So here we have three events: the tick, timer start and timer stop. So I think they are pretty explanatory. And okay, so the next thing we have to do is integrate our main.dart file. Before we do that, I think now we can import whatever things we need to import in these files. Okay, so socket service, we can import it from our socket service.dart, and time events we can import from our socket events.dart. Okay, that's good. Then we go to the socket service.dart. So it's not giving me the opportunity to quick fix that. So this is not the correct one. Let me run flutter pub get. Hopefully this will solve this issue. Maybe some problem with Flutter itself not recognizing our installed socket.io package. Okay, let me check now. Go to quick fix. Yeah, now we can see it. So if you don't see this one to be quick fixed first time, please run flutter space pub space get. Then you will be able to use that. Okay, the next thing we have to fix here is import the time events from socket events and then the stream socket from our stream socket.dart. Okay, now we have done everything we have to do up to this point. The final thing we have to do is use this main.dart to update the code related to our UI. First, I think it would be very easy if we get rid of these default comments by Flutter. So I will pause the video and get rid of all these comments in our main.dart. Okay, so I have gotten rid of the default comments in our main.dart. Let's see what we have to do next. Okay, you can see the structure of the main.dart file. So we have the main method, and then inside that we run app. So this is the basic entry point of our Flutter application. And then we have three classes. The first one is a stateless widget, which is the my app default my app. And then we have another stateful widget like this, my home page. Okay, so let's do what each of these comments tell us to do. Okay, the first thing is set up material app. That is already done to us by default. So we can see our material app is here. So we don't have to do anything in the class my app. And in the home page, my home page class, we have to initiate the state. I think that is also done for us. Okay, yes. So the only thing we have to write code in is this my home page state. Okay, so let's do it. In this my home page state class, we have to do three things. The first one is to implement a method called convert to display time. Now what this method does is it converts the data received from a backend as seconds to a displayable time. For example, if you get 180 as the data from our backend, then we have to convert it into minutes and seconds. So that is done by this convert to display time method. Then this init state is sort of like an initialization of our stateful widget. So that is also a default thing that we have to do with Flutter. And then this build method is where we are actually writing the logic and the code related to our user interface. Okay, so let's do the first thing, that is to implement this method, that is convert to display time. And we can do it replacing this default counter because we don't need it anymore. Okay, that is good. And the next thing we have to do is use a stream builder. Now I have not actually given whole source code for this main.dart in the blog article itself because it was going to be a lot longer. The actual thing we have to do is copy all these things, and then you can put all this code inside a column widget. Okay, so you have the default column widget, and then inside this we can replace all these and then paste our code like this. Okay, then you can import whatever things are missing here. So this socket service we can import, and then stream socket we can import. Okay, so I'll explain what this whole piece of code that we just copied does. The first thing is, you can see that we have used the ternary operator in Flutter. So this is like we have this condition, and if this condition is true, then this first thing before this colon you can see, I hope you can see this colon. So if this condition is true, whatever to the left side of that colon will be returned. If this condition is false, then whatever is to the right side will be returned. So simply, if the socket is connected and it is not null, and if it is connected and not null, then we are going to return a stream builder with all this data, all this code. And if it is false, which means either the socket is null or the socket is not connected, then we are going to return this text that says socket status disconnected. So that is what we are going to do in this code. Now the reason we are using a stream builder is so that we can assign the stream, that is our stream socket, if you remember, that we implemented here. So this thing, I mentioned that we are using this to easily update our UI. So when you use that socket response as our stream, you can easily update our UI whenever we are getting any data, any new data to this stream socket. That means whenever we get a new data from our backend to our stream socket, then we can update our user interface automatically using this stream builder. So that is why we are doing this stream builder approach. Now all of these are related to Flutter, not related to WebSockets. So there may be many alternative methods to display the data coming from our NestJS backend in our Flutter interface UI. Okay, so I'm just having the stream builder method. I'm not telling this is the only method to do this. Keep that in mind. Okay, let's move on. Now we actually don't need a floating action button, so let's remove it. And now let's move to the next part. Okay, the next thing we have to do is implement the code related to various buttons. So the connect button, start and stop timer button. So yeah, let's copy these codes. The first thing is inside this column as children, we are going to paste the first button, that is the connect button. So here what it happens is on pressed of this button, we are going to execute these codes. Okay, so whenever I click the connect socket button, it will do these things. The first thing it does is it tries to connect to our socket connection, and it is by calling this connect and listen to socket method that we implemented in our socket service dart file. So it is going to call this method. Now remember that method expects two arguments, auth token and device ID. So for now we are just passing two strings. Okay, so if you are doing this on a production application, you might want to consider actually getting a token from your authentication service like Firebase, and then getting a device ID using a package like device info plus. So we have one error here. Let's see what that error does. Instance member connect and listen to socket can't be accessed using static access. Okay, so we have forgotten to insert the static keyword here. Yeah, that solves that issue. Okay, and the other thing is this is we are setting up a listener, another listener, just like we set up in our socket service. So we have set up several listeners here, and here also when we click that button to connect, we are setting a new listener, and that listener will be fired on any of the events. So whenever there is a connection, a disconnection or an error, any event, this is going to call this. That means set state. So this is because we want to update the UI so that we can display the socket status, and to do that we need to set state whenever there is a change in the status of our socket connection. That is why we have this listener. Okay, so the rest of the things are just for displaying purposes like the text, icon and the color. Okay, let's move on. And then we have the two buttons for start and stop timers. We'll paste it here and then import the timer service so that we can call those two methods. Basically what these two buttons do is just call the start and stop methods of our timer service. So these two buttons are just there for that purpose. So now we have three buttons. Let's load our emulator again and see how it looks in our UI. Okay, so you can see we have the socket status disconnected label, and then connect socket button and start and stop server countdown buttons. Okay, so this is looking great, and we need to implement two more buttons for the disconnect and dispose sockets. Okay, here then disconnect and dispose socket buttons. Let's copy them and then paste it below this buttons. Okay, so what these two buttons do is just basically calling the method on our socket service to disconnect the socket and then to dispose the socket. So as I explained earlier, this disconnect socket does not clear the listeners but the dispose socket will clear all the listeners. But both of these buttons will disconnect the socket. Okay, so the only difference is dispose socket, in addition to disconnecting the socket, it will also remove all the listeners. So if you want to start fresh, you have to use this dispose socket. Okay everyone, we have added the buttons as well. Oh yeah, we have come to the final moments of our tutorial series, I guess. Okay, hopefully, fingers crossed, now we are going to connect to our backend application and then see if our implementation is working. One final thing is our backend is not yet running. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is go to our backend and open an integrated terminal, and then we have the terminal for our backend, and then run npm run start dev. So this will start our NestJS application or the backend server in development mode. So we hit enter, and then we will get this in our terminal, which means our backend is running without any errors. Okay, so now let me minimize the backend and then go to our main.dart or something like that, any other Dart file, and then we are going to refresh our front end, and then hopefully when I click on this connect socket, it will connect to our backend. So let's check. We click on this. Alright, it's connected to our NestJS server. So we have successfully connected our Flutter front end to our NestJS server. But that's not enough, friends. We need to check whether our server-side timer is actually working. Okay, so let me click on the start server countdown, and yes, it is working. So I'm really happy about this. And you can see it starts the countdown from 10. That's because we are telling our Flutter front end we need to have a timer with 10 seconds. So if you need to check it, I'm really excited about this. That's why I'm actually missing the words. So if you need to actually change the amount of times, what we have to do is change this in our connect button. Okay, so not the start timer button. Okay, so here you can maybe change it to 20, and so the next time we click on this start server countdown, it will start from 20. Okay, so this is not happening on our front end. This logic is not running on our front end. These all things happening in the back end. So you can see this is our backend console actually, and you can see our countdown is taking place. Now if you need to make sure that everything is working fine, let's just end our server, Control C, and we have stopped our backend server. Now if we are going to dispose the socket and then try to connect, it does not connect, right? And if you go to the debug console, you can say socket exception and connection refused. That's because we don't have a running backend application. So in fact, this timer, even if I click on this start server countdown, it's not gonna work. Okay, so it says no socket connection found in the terminal. That is because our timer is in fact running on server and we are just displaying it on our front end. So we are going to run our server again, and this time we're going to click connect, and it's connected, and then click start server countdown, and again it works without any problem. We can also dispose the socket and then reconnect, and then still it is continuing from where we left off. Okay, so even if we disconnect our socket, still the timer is running on our backend. That is the beauty of a server-side timer, right? It doesn't matter whether your client is disconnected, it is disconnected from internet, etc. Still that timer is running on our backend. That is why, as we discussed in our first video, there is no time for the user to manipulate our timer even if we wanted. So this is very useful for applications like quiz applications where we need to maintain the integrity of our timer. Okay, so I hope Now we are convinced that this is a server time in fact, and this is working well as we have expected. That is basically it, and you can see some common errors. So WebSocket exception connection to this IP address was not upgraded to WebSocket. So this is a common error when you forget to add this sockets gateway as a provider in the app-module.ts in the NestJS background, NestJS backend application. And then in the next error, socket exception network is unreachable. So this is probably due to an error in setting up your IP address. So make sure you correctly set your IP address and the port. So those are two most common errors that you will encounter in this implementation. Okay friends, I think this brings us to the end of this tutorial series. This has been my first ever YouTube tutorial series, and I'm really happy to have concluded it like this. And I hope you have learned something new or cleared some doubts of yours. And if you have any comments or feedback regarding my presentation or the project or this tutorial series as a whole, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to follow my written tutorial. I will link it in the description below. I will also share the source code for this project in my GitHub. So, like, comment, dislike if you disliked it, and subscribe to my channel, and I will bring more content like this if you are interested. So let me know, and till then, take care. Bye bye.